Chapter 7. The Doctors. There was a silver moon high in the sky, which threw dark and light shadows over the buildings. The only colours were shades of black, grey and white, with silvery flashes of chrome from the hubcaps on cars, door handles or window frames, and so on. Delwyn stood up and looked around, straining her ears, but she heard nothing unusual. She could have been back in the real world, or could have been in a Brassai photograph. She heard a meow and then saw Peter running towards her. She deliberately locked him in the house, and now she was confused. Had he escaped through an open window and followed her there? She'd closed the door of the flat behind her and was quite sure that there were no windows open in that building. She bent down and picked him up. He was three-dimensional and in colour like she was. He was also wet, as though he'd been through the rain or even the lake with the snake. She shrugged her shoulders and put him down, and he ran over to sniff at the cars when Varun appeared in a puff of black smoke. Delwyn nearly had a heart attack. "Varun! Oh, my God!" "Thank you," he said mockingly. He was silver and chrome, with black eyes. "Well, you've evaded your responsibilities yet again. You're like a broken record, aren't you?" He glowered at her, and she realised that she could see her reflection in his silver tail. "Don't even think about it. It won't work anyway, sneaky woman." "I wasn't going to do anything," she lied, and looked around this way and that in total confusion as Peter ran off after a mouse down an alley. "Where are we?" she asked. Varun seemed nonplussed and said, "It matters not." "Really?" she asked. Varun started floating down the street and shrugged his shoulders in response. What game was he playing? She ran after him. "Where are you going?" He stopped and turned to face her, taking in a deep breath, preparing for a lecture. "I am merely a guide in this world. What you see, hear, taste, feel, smell, think, and experience is a summation of everything that has happened in your mortal life. They are things that have been stored in your subconscious, which are brought into play into this world, much like props in a theatre, prompted by your fears, desires, and motivations." She looked at him dumbly, understanding but not comprehending at the same time. She didn't know where he was going with this, and he could see it. He wondered why she was so special if she was so slow on the uptake. He realised that he had to spell it out for her, obviously, yet again. "In this realm, my darling, you are in charge to a point. What you see and experience is coming from deep inside you. Take note of everything that happens and explore, but take care." He shook his webbed finger in her face. "There are some things you hide from, things you have repressed. In order to fully understand yourself, you must face the shadow. You must integrate and absorb all the facets of your psyche, the good, the bad, and the ugly." He studied her face and obviously realised that even though she was an adult, she was still childish and frightened easily. He reached out and grabbed her by the shoulders. "Do you have the strength to face your fears?" She gulped and strained to search for courage in her heart. "I'm trying," was all she could muster. He let go of her and shook his head, smiling with his eyes. "Yes, you are. Well," he turned to float away. "Good luck, and summon me when you flounder. I might come and help, it all depends." In a puff of blue smoke he disappeared, and she was left on the dark street. She wondered where to begin and looked around, trying to figure out why she was in a dark city at night. What could that represent? Peter came running out of the alley with a dead mouse in his mouth. She winced and said, "Oh, Peter, why?" He laid it at her feet proudly and ran off again. When she looked down at it, she saw it breathing again, coming back to life. Then it started growing larger and morphing into a shiny grey lump. The silver moonlight reflected on it and made it seem magical to her, but she stepped back and watched it grow larger and larger. As it grew, she could see thin veins under the surface, pulsing. Feet were extending under the mass, then arms started forming at the sides and reached out to her as it kept growing and pulsing. The hands were gnarled and slippery, and they became more urgent in their grabbing at her, so she ran to the other side of the street and hid behind a car. The lump now started standing up, and she saw that it did not have a head or even a neck. It was just a body with arms and legs, which turned in her direction to reveal a hideous face on its stomach. The mouth was murmuring something she couldn't make out, and as it murmured, a black substance oozed out of the corners of the mouth. Now that it was fully formed, it started making its way towards her, and she screamed, running out from behind of the car. She heard the gurgling sound the creature made as it stomped clumsily after her.
Delwyn!
It yelled, like it was being strangled at the same time. She ran down the street in terror, not daring to look back, hearing the stomping and gurgling just a few feet behind her. The creature was at least 7 feet tall, and its long legs made great strides, even though it was clumsy. She could also hear the splatter of the black ooze hitting the ground with each step the creature took, and the bellowing continued.
Delwyn!
As she reached the corner of the street, she felt one of the creature's hands grab her hair. It tried to drag her back, but she screamed and tore away from it, yelling, "Leave me alone!" She ran across the street into the shadows and tried to open one of the doors of the office buildings there, but it was locked. She kept running along the street, banging on the windows, trying to get into various doors, with no luck. The monster had crossed the street and was now also in the shadows. She couldn't see it, but she could hear it, stomping, bellowing and splattering ooze as it closed in. For a moment she remembered Varun's words about facing the shadow, but fear propelled her. Then a yellow light appeared in the distance. It was from a doorway, and Peter peered around, as if to say, "In here." She raced towards it and scrambled inside, with no time to shut the door. She followed Peter to the elevators, but the creature was also coming through the door, squeezing its large bulk through the frame. She pushed the button over and over in a frenzy, but the elevator wouldn't come. The light and bell went off as if it had arrived, but the doors wouldn't open. Peter meowed in a panic and ran off as the creature made it through the door and started thundering towards them, arms flailing wildly.
Delwyn!
Delwyn screamed again and ran after Peter, around the corner to the door of the stairwell. Making sure she slammed the door shut this time, she turned to run up the stairs and realised that it was no ordinary stairwell. It was like a crazy maze of stairs. When they got up to the top, there was a landing and then stairs to the left leading down to nowhere. They got to the bottom, but then saw more stairs leading up to the right, then another landing with an entrance to a spiral staircase. They ran up for what seemed like ages until they reached a mezzanine. Then they could hear the creature yelling, stomping and splattering ooze, sometimes far away, sometimes like it was right behind them. After what seemed like hours, running up and down, back and forth, Delwyn broke down and started crying. She said to Peter, "It's no use." She bent down to pick him up, but he vanished into thin air. She called out, "Peter! Peter, where did you go?" A door flew open and Delwyn realised that she was in a hallway, not in the stairwell. She couldn't hear the creature, but she did hear a shh. She turned around and saw the beautiful lady again, this time dressed as a businesswoman in an impeccable suit, wearing glasses, with her long black hair tied up in a bun. She had her index finger to her mouth and she was shushing Delwyn. "Oh, I'm sorry," said Delwyn, trying to compose herself, wiping the sweat from her brow. "I've lost my cat, and I was being chased by a monster." The woman looked at her quizzically, like she was pondering whether to call the police or the crisis assessment team. "At any rate, people are trying to work here." The woman softened, smiled a little, then pulled a card out of her jacket pocket and handed it to Delwyn. "You might need his services if you're being chased by a monster." Delwyn took the card, which was light grey with small black lettering. It read, Dr. F. Purr, subcologist, oncologist, psyche specialist. Delwyn frowned. I don't understand. The woman smiled and waved her inside the office. You will. Delwyn followed the woman inside and sat down on the sofa, which was the only colourful thing she'd seen in this grey city. It was a deep burgundy and was soft, plush and velvet. She sank into it and it seemed to hug her as she settled in. For some reason she started thinking about her mother and the tears started flowing, so she quickly jumped up and chose a cold grey chair next to the woman's desk. The woman had a nameplate next to her telephone that said Daphne Black. Delwyn was starting to realise that Daphne was important in a mysterious way. She pulled a grey tissue from the black tissue box and Daphne looked over at her with pity. Sofa too close? Delwyn didn't know what she meant, but at the same time she did, and then she didn't want to answer. She just blew her nose, wiped away her tears, and answered like a child, I don't know. For some reason she felt an affinity with Daphne and wanted to confide in her or ask for a hug. That made her feel foolish, so she pushed it aside. With that, the other door opened and Delwyn couldn't believe what she was seeing. It was a cat-headed man in a grey suit. The cat head was black with green eyes, and the body was definitely a man. He came over to Delwyn with his hand outstretched. She shook his hand, dumbfounded that it wasn't a paw, but had to remind herself where she was and that anything was possible. He spoke in a man's voice, although it was soft, deep and soothing. Hello, young lady. I'm Dr. Purr. Come in and have a seat. He turned to Daphne and said, Hold my calls, will you? She smiled and said, Of course, Doctor. He led Delwyn into his large office which overlooked the grey city, and she sat in one of his comfortable black leather armchairs. Would you like some coffee, tea, or milk? She shook her head and smiled. No thanks. She puzzled about what was going on and how she was going to regain control if that's what she was supposed to do. He went to his desk and sat down, pulling a bowl of milk over and lapping just like a cat. Then he pulled out a handkerchief and wiped his mouth and whiskers in a gentlemanly fashion. Delwyn tried not to giggle. He cleared his throat and loosened his tie. Now, let's get down to business, shall we? He smiled a kitty smile. Delwyn was confused. Business? She fidgeted, unsure of what was going on. Yes, business. That's what you're here for, isn't it? He cocked his head and his cat ears twitched ever so slightly. What kind of business? She asked, feeling foolish but wanting to know. Well, if you don't know, then why are you here? He sounded slightly exasperated. She fidgeted some more, unsure of how to proceed. I came here by accident. She knew that it sounded ridiculous, but it was true in a way. By accident? My dear, there are no accidents. You will come to discover that in time. He smiled again, sarcastically now. She felt uneasy. What do you mean? She asked, not really wanting to know. He leaned back in his chair, playing with his cufflinks, looking out of the window with a philosophical air about him. Sighing, he said, Well, everything happens for a reason, even if it doesn't seem so. Even if it seems unrelated. Somewhere, somehow, someplace in time, there's a link. The word jumped into Delwyn's mind and she blurted it out. Synchronicity! Dr. Purr gasped excitedly. Yes, you're on the right track. Well, what's that got to do with me? She whined and slumped in the chair. Dr. Purr also slumped in despair. Do you always zigzag in and out of brilliance, my dear girl? Delwyn pouted. The doctor continued. What brought you to my office? He watched her carefully as she started remembering the ooze-splattering monster. She moved uneasily in the chair with a grimace on her face. That horrible thing. She sat up and turned around, half expecting to see it lurking in the corner. Dr. Purr laughed softly. Don't worry, it's gone, for now. She turned back and asked, Where's Peter? The doctor shrugged. Around. Don't worry about him. Felines can take care of themselves. He picked up a fluffy stress ball from his desk that was in the shape of a grey mouse. He squeezed and tossed it about as he continued. Why did you run from the monster? Delwyn shook her head half-heartedly, not wanting to answer the question. Well, I was scared, of course. Wouldn't you be? He snuffled and shrugged again. Not my monster, so no, I wouldn't. Why didn't you face it? I'm not ready. Then why are you here? She started to grow uneasy. It was Varun all over again. She was too scared. She didn't want to tell the truth, to admit that she was just sightseeing. The doctor stopped tossing the stress ball around and snatched it out of the air for emphasis. He smoothed his long whiskers with his manicured fingers, staring at Delwyn in a meditative trance, but still present. I believe you know one of my colleagues, Dr. Vorunsky. For a minute she thought he was joking and tried not to snigger. I beg your pardon? She smiled ironically, observing his studied boredom as he admired his clean fingernails. Dr. Vorunsky, I think you two have met. She assumed that he meant Varun, but was afraid to say so and slyly shook her head. You're quite a liar, aren't you? He said wearily, looking away as though growing tired of their conversation. Half annoyed that a supposedly imaginary being was getting the better of her, and half embarrassed that she'd been caught in a lie, she blurted, Don't you mean Varun? He purred so quietly for a moment that she wondered if she'd imagined it, but then he got up from his desk and walked around it slowly, carefully choosing his words, deep in thought. Sitting on the front of his desk and crossing his arms casually, he gazed at her like a parent would when addressing a petulant child. That's a little informal, don't you think? He raised one of his cat eyebrows but didn't wait for a response. I do know that he would have explained the rules to you, and as far as I can see, you're spending a good amount of time playing and not much time working. She felt like a child being scolded for monkeying around, but said nothing and allowed the lecture to continue, watching him walk around the room in his feline way, picking up objects here and there as though discovering them for the first time. That's why you're always being chased, begging for assistance, screaming, asking why, demanding, expecting. She cut him off. Hang on a minute. I don't have to sit here and take this from you. You're a cat-headed man in a make-believe world. She didn't move, as something in her wanted to wait and see how it was all going to play out. He slammed the snow globe he was holding down on the desk and hissed at her. Make-believe. Pretend. Magic. Is that it? Is this all unreal? Isn't this world what you've always dreamed about? He was closing in on her, menacing and furious. If he'd had a tail, it would have been swishing angrily. She sat dumbly, not knowing how to respond. It was what she had wished for, to a degree, but she'd wanted total control. Aha! He said triumphantly, reading her mind. On the one hand, you want to let go of all responsibilities, to surrender to the unknown, to disappear down the rabbit hole. But on the other hand, you want to control how it all eventuates, the ins and outs, dictate and manage everything. Is that right? He was incensed and filled with rage, the hair on the back of his head spiking and his eyes flashing. He leaned over Delwyn, each hand grabbing the arms of her chair, his whiskered face just centimetres away from hers, hissing and growling. Delwyn's mind raced and her heart pounded. But please don't hurt me, she whimpered. He jerked backwards in disgust and spat for emphasis. Psst! Pleading, whining, fear. How predictable you Alethians are. You're all the same, always the same. This piqued her interest, as the fear took a back seat for a minute. She sat up straight and watched him stride over to the window, looking out over the grey city. "What do you mean it's always the same? And what are Alethians?" From behind she saw his whiskers twitch and his shoulders slightly slump in defeat. "You humans, you're all the same," he almost whispered in his husky cat voice. She stood up, brave now and more curious. No, you said Alethians. And what did you mean by it's always the same?" He looked over his shoulder at her and shrugged nonchalantly. "It's not for you to know." "But I want to know." "You want to know a lot, don't you?" he said, tired of her demanding whine. He looked back over the city, already dismissing her. "After you've done the work, you'll discover the truth." He walked back to his desk, sat down, and started squeezing his stress mouse, watching her dispassionately. "What work?" she asked, meekly now, but she already knew. She knew that the next time she came, she'd have to get serious and face her shadow. She looked at the stress mouse and said calmly, "I'd like to ram that down your throat." He smiled and said, "I know." Daphne came in with Peter and handed him to Delwyn. Peter and Dr. Purr hissed at each other. "How do I get out of here?" Delwyn asked. Dr. Purr pointed to the door. "Simple, really. Just use your imagination." She stomped over to the door and opened it. She was shocked to see the vantage point of the other side of the mirror. Without further ado, she threw Peter in unceremoniously and turned to look at Dr. Purr, who cocked his head and said, "There's still so much to discuss." She snorted and jumped through to the other side. Once they landed in the flat, Delwyn turned around and saw Dr. Purr's office slowly disappear like an image on TV. Then she quickly checked her watch. Only 25 minutes had passed. They left the flat and made their way back to the house. The rain was still pouring down, and they entered through the back into her room. Peter dawdled off to the kitchen as Delwyn threw herself onto her bed, her mind racing with the events of her third visit to the dreamworld. She didn't even care that she was wet from the rain. Everything that had happened on Delwyn's third adventure in the mirror had been such a juxtaposition, such a mishmash, that her brain could hardly contain it all. She was like a schizophrenic kaleidoscope, the sensations wrenching her cells this way and that. Fear, sex, confusion, anger, despair, all mixing together to create a tidal wave that threatened to drown her very being. She lay there trying to absorb it all so that she could get to a point where she could start recording it in her journal. She thought of the serpentine lovemaking and her senses were suddenly ignited again. It made her think of Greg as well as Mark. She realised that she was feeling lust for both of them, but then it wouldn't have mattered, as it was the thought of the act itself that consumed her. At that point, almost any male would do. She never had felt that primal or that needy, ravenous for flesh, to be filled. How she longed for that kind of annihilation. It frightened and thrilled her at the same time. If she had just used the dream world as a playground, at least for those ends, would it still have meant something or created a ripple, like Varun had said? She thought to herself that up to that point in her life she had been sleepwalking in regards to her relationships with men and her sexuality. Maybe it was necessary for her to lash out and experience that colossal entwining to unleash the beast inside her. However, it seemed that the menacing laughter had ridiculed her, like she either didn't deserve it or was the brunt of a secret joke. Delwyn didn't want to think about the house or her mother, being chaste and always running, as Dr. Purr had said. She knew that he was an echo of Dr. Purdieu, and for a moment she felt saddened by the possibility that perhaps the dream world wasn't real, or that it really was a hallucination or an actual dream. It was all about facing her shadows, and she was angry at herself for not having the strength to face them. Why were they so much more horrifying in dreams? It seemed so much easier to deal with a human in the real world, no matter how frightening they were. Before entering the mirror, she'd thought it was the other way around. Being physically present in the realm of dreams gave it a whole new twist. The horror was so much more real and urgent, likely to inflict some kind of damage. Even if that wasn't true, it's how it felt to Delwyn. Theorising about how to face the shadow was fine, but doing it for real, especially when actually physically present, was a whole new ballgame. She was mad that Varun wasn't as friendly, playful or helpful as the first 2 times. Fairly enough, he had warned her about using Onesol as a playground, but he had given her permission to play the last time she was there, as she had worked so hard. Anyway, who could blame her for exploring some facets that she was too afraid to explore in the real world? Maybe it was all right to use it as a training ground to test her skills before using them in the concrete world. She would try to discuss this with him on her next visit, even though it was difficult to remember all that she'd wanted to talk about, and he did tend to throw her off with his changing colours and moods. She also contemplated the possibility that his strict rules could have been a subconscious throwback, something from within herself that was trying to reel her in. It was all so complicated it started to make her head hurt. As she lay there, she thought about Greg and Mark again, and her zone started pulsing even more. She felt bad for doing so, but thinking wasn't a crime, was it? What did make her feel shame was that she had as much desire for Mark as she did for Greg, maybe even more so, although he was a cold-hearted bastard who probably loathed her. Maybe that was the attraction. After recording everything that she could remember, she fell into a dreamless sleep, but it only lasted another 45 minutes when she was awoken by Gwen returning from her shopping trip. She heard the grocery bags being flung on the kitchen table and her aunt calling for her. She wearily got up and dragged herself into the kitchen. "Oh, did you go back to bed? Those pills must be kicking your butt." Gwen seemed a little annoyed and glanced up at the clock as Delwyn started going through the bags and putting them away. "You do remember that you have your second session with Dr. Purdieu at 2 o'clock, she asked, grabbing the apples from Delwyn's hands, worried with her sleepy appearance. "Oh shit, no. Do I have to? Today?" Delwyn continued pulling things out of the bags, pouting and frowning as she dragged her feet back and forth to the cupboards. Her long hair was tangled and her clothes were dishevelled, which didn't go unnoticed. "Jesus, girl, where have you been? In a war zone?" Gwen grabbed Delwyn by the shoulders and spun her around to take a closer look, which annoyed her. "Don't worry about it. I was in the garden and I fell over in the rain. Okay?" It was the best Delwyn could do to come up with a feasible lie, still half asleep and frustrated over having to go for another session and possibly being caught out. She shrugged off her aunt's attempts to straighten out her clothes and hair. Once again it was time for Gwen to pull rank. "Delwyn, how old are you?" "Oh my God!" She stopped and glared at Gwen with her hazel eyes, knowing what was coming, still holding the cans of tomato soup. "Well, how old are you? The last time I checked you were a 30-year-old woman, not a bloody 12-year-old on a bloody holiday at the farm." She glared back at Delwyn with her soft brown eyes that were tired of seeing her niece taking refuge in crazy behaviour. She was obviously sick of the childishness. Delwyn decided against slamming the cans down onto the table and said in as calm a voice as she could conjure, "Auntie Gwen, I appreciate everything you're doing for me. I'm trying my hardest to work it all out. I will go to the fucking session, but please stop hassling me, will you?" As the two of them stared at each other in a Mexican standoff, Peter casually strolled in from the lounge room and jumped up on the table in between them, knocking one of the cans onto the floor and flopping onto his back, begging Delwyn for a rub on his belly. She tried not to look at him, but could see her aunt slowly beginning to crack a smile. It wasn't long before she too started smiling, and the two of them lunged into each other's arms, laughing and turning to Peter to rub his belly and make much of him. "Oh, how canny you are, Peter," Gwen said, not realising the pun. "Canny, ha!" Delwyn said, picking up the other can of soup, and they laughed some more. They finished putting the shopping away and went to have fish and chips for lunch in Seaspray before heading off to Dr. Purdieu's. Delwyn was hoping that Gwen wasn't sick of her already and was extra sweet and helpful, trying to show her that she meant to be on the up and up. When she walked into Dr. Purdieu's study, she decided that she would be agreeable and forthcoming. She watched him closely for any resemblance to Dr. Purr in the dreamworld. He was sleek and feline and was always impeccably dressed. It was obvious that he was well off, as well he should be, with the reputation he had for being a renowned psychotherapist. His mannerisms were cultured and his accent reflected the many exotic places he'd visited. The differences were slight, such as Dr. Purr being slightly exaggerated in his snobbishness and style, and Dr. Purdieu being calm and passive, but without any sense of weakness. Just like the first visit, he offered her the couch and a beverage, both of which she declined. They sat down, and as Delwyn expected, he flipped open his notebook and said, "Now, where were we?" She didn't speak, but waited for him to announce the starting point. She had deliberately worn her sensible black slacks and pale blue shirt with black loafers, as if she were attending a job interview. Her hair was brushed and she wore a neat black headband to keep her hair in place. She wanted to appear simple and in control, both of which she was not. She had only the barest amount of makeup on and wore her thin silver chain around her neck and her thin strapped watch on her slim wrist. Dr. Purdieu was taking his time, reading his notes, which made her a little uncomfortable, but she waited patiently, not wanting to appear impudent. Finally, he raised his eyebrows and looked up at her, closing the notebook, which surprised her. "Well, I'd like to try something different this time, if you're up for it, Delwyn." He smiled and seemed to have an adventurous air about him. Delwyn didn't feel adventurous. She wanted things to be steadfast and sure, dependable and commonplace, just like they were supposed to be in the real world. Normally she would jump at the chance to try something different, but her life was at stake and she was already treading on thin ice with her aunt. She didn't let on that she was a little thrown off, however, and smiled sweetly at him, asking, "What did you have in mind?" He set the notebook and pen on the table next to him and then clasped his hands in front of his chest. Smiling warmly, he then said, "How do you feel about hypnosis?" He held her gaze as he needed to see what her reaction would be. She knew what he was doing and did her best to be flippant and carefree. "Hypnosis? Sounds like fun." She giggled, but felt the sweat prickling in her armpits and tried not to fidget, as she knew that would give her away. Forcing a wide grin, she asked, "Are you trying to rabbit out my secrets?" They laughed, but he wouldn't tear his gaze away from her. He had known right from the beginning that Delwyn was hiding something, that there was quite a lot that she was keeping to herself. It seemed to him that she was like a giant messy ball of many pieces of twine, wool and string, tied together and bundled up tightly, with a little string peeking out from under it. He wondered what would happen if he tugged hard enough. The small tugging hadn't unravelled much. She had held her cards tight to her chest. He knew that something was hiding in the middle of that mass, and he didn't want to waste valuable time tugging, pulling and teasing over weeks, months, or even years. Even though this was only the second session, he knew that there was a lot going on with Delwyn and that she was going to be with him for a long time. That was something he could usually tell with the first session, and time was already running out for Delwyn. She didn't need to be lost in that jungle forever. He'd seen it happen to too many people, and he could see that Delwyn had a spark that needed to be ignited before she got too much older and started getting into chemical dependence, if she hadn't started already, or before she was lost in the haze of mental illness. He leaned forward and raised an eyebrow at her, attempting to be playful. "They wouldn't be secrets if you were willing to tell." She smiled, but not so convincingly, as it turned into worry. Quickly she realized that she was slipping, and she laughed a little nervously. "What should I be telling you? I'm intrigued." He leaned back again. She was going to be difficult. Well, it's not so much what you should be telling me, it's probably more like what is the root of the problem. Maybe even what do you hide from yourself? He studied her response again, needing to see her silent body language in order to lay out all the pieces of the puzzle. Delwyn didn't skip a beat. But you said they wouldn't be secrets if you were willing to tell, so that means you think I'm deliberately hiding something. She pouted playfully like a child, just a little saddened that for once she might have been smarter than him. He laughed out loud, throwing his head back like Greg. For some reason this stirred something akin to desire in her, but at the same time she was disgusted, or rather annoyed with herself. He was much older and definitely not her type. What was it? Was it that they were exposing their throats, a sign of vulnerability? As she pondered this thought, she was not paying attention to the fact that Dr. Purdieu was watching her intently. She straightened herself up and waited for his response. "What were you thinking about? Right now, just now?" he asked, playful again, with a cheesy grin on his face. She thought quickly. "Oh, you remind me of a friend of mine, Greg, that's all. Anyway, answer my question." She liked feeling as though she had one up on the doctor. He shrugged and said in a calm voice, "You were the one who mentioned rabbiting out secrets, so I assumed that you were hiding something." He had her on that one. She felt the prickling under her arms again and couldn't help being defensive. "I'm not hiding anything," she said meekly, looking away and trying to think of something else to add, something witty. She was drawing blanks. "So then let me explain why I think hypnosis is a good tool, especially for someone who has a particular set of issues, such as yourself," he said coercively. All she could say was, "Okay." He continued talking about the benefits of rooting out old pain, secret shame, buried memories and forgotten abuse that could be unearthed for the purpose of analysis, assimilation and understanding. Then the patient could achieve the freedom of being able to move on without lugging the heavy load of anxiety, depression, mental and physical illnesses, and have a happier life. It all sounded so swimmingly wonderful when Dr. Purdieu told it. He wrapped it up with a lovely pink bow, and Delwyn told him so. "You make it sound so easy, like just grabbing a shovel and digging for gold." This time he didn't laugh or smile. He rested his head on his right fist, propped up by his elbow on the arm of his chair, and explained that it wasn't all a bed of roses. "Of course, it's not easy, Delwyn. Nothing worth doing is easy. It's hard work. It would take several sessions. It's all done piecemeal. You might find that we only tackle one memory at a time. There could be a lot of tears, anguish, despair. I've found that sometimes in some patients, even physical ailments show up out of nowhere. Mental problems can manifest themselves physically, so that's always a risk. But with time and proper analysis, we can put things in perspective and clear the path to make your future seem a little brighter. Doesn't that seem worth it?" He'd been watching her fidget as he spoke. She knew that everything he was saying was correct and what she should want to hear. All she could think about was how she could maintain control and not slip up and talk about the dream world in the mirror. The idea horrified her. Dr. Purdieu broke her out of her panic by asking, "Is everything all right, Delwyn? You know you could stop the hypnotism at any time if you like. We would have a keyword or sound. You'd snap right out of it." That thought hadn't occurred to her, and she was instantly relieved. "Oh, of course," she sighed and decided to think quickly. "Well, there's just some crap with my mother that makes me nervous." Dr. Purdieu had an idea that she was using that as an excuse, but he let it go. Yes, I understand. Well, shall we get on with it?" He wasn't wasting any time. Delwyn took out her water bottle and took a big swig. She'd thought that he might wait until her next visit, but they had some time left and she felt better with the idea of an out in case things got hairy. She didn't explain her cue to Dr. Purdieu even when he casually asked. "I want to snap out of it if I see a mirror. Is that okay?" He sighed like a patient father and said, "Sure, if that works for you, but one day you must promise to tell me why." She smiled but thought secretly, "No chance in hell, buddy." She decided to move to the couch and lie down as Dr. Purdieu sat in the chair next to it. He brought over a voice recorder which she agreed to and placed it on the small glass table between them. "Are you comfortable?" "Yes, thanks." "Warm enough?" "I'm fine, thanks." She was actually too warm, but just wanted to get it over with. Hopefully nothing would come of it, and he would abandon this line of therapy altogether. He clicked the button on the recorder and started speaking in his rich, warm voice. "This is Dr. Alan Purdieu with Delwyn Tidwell on the 2nd of February 2010. It's 2:15 p.m. and this is Delwyn's second session. This is the first hypnosis session and her cue is mirror." This annoyed Delwyn, but she didn't say anything. She lay still as his voice calmly told her to relax and progressively feel her muscles from her toes right up to her scalp tense and release over and over until she and her whole body were under. He led her slowly through the years, talking about her marriage, living alone, being a teenager with her mother, and so on. Delwyn didn't feel that she was hypnotized, but went along with it to please Dr. Purdieu. In a way, she was happy to deceive him like this, giving him pat answers to the questions she knew he would ask. She feigned fears at appropriate places and gasped in horror when discussing her mother, but the doctor was obviously no fool. He also played along, biding his time, waiting for the hammer to fall. And fall it did. Without warning, Delwyn lost control. There was no telling who was in control, but she started blathering about Varun and the dream world. She'd completely bypassed the mirror, but stayed under all the same. Dr. Purdieu was flabbergasted by what was coming out of her mouth. "Who is Varun?" he asked. "The guide to the dream world." "Is he a ghost?" Delwyn reacted like a child responding to a funny uncle.
"No, he's half man and half seahorse, silly."
Dr. Purdieu cleared his throat. "Half seahorse?" She continued talking like a 5-year-old.
"Yes, and every time we see him he's a different colour, as well as his eyes."
"We? Who's we?" the doctor asked incredulously.
"Me and Peter, of course."
She giggled, which made the hair on the back of his neck stand up. "Who is Peter?" he pressed.
"Auntie Gwen's cat, the ginger cat. Peter, you know."
Dr. Purdieu couldn't believe what he was hearing. He knew that Delwyn suffered from a sleep disorder and that she dabbled in dream interpretation, but this was too wacky. Maybe she really had gone over the deep end. He decided that he would get her seen by another psychiatrist and have more tests done after checking with her aunt. Before he'd do that, though, he knew that he had to keep up with the session, partly for the sake of Delwyn's therapy and partly out of plain curiosity. He continued with the questioning. "When you say dream world, do you mean your dreams?" She sighed impatiently.
"No, everyone's."
He thought that he was beginning to understand. "Ah, so it feels like you're sharing it with others."
"No, I go into it with my body. Varun says I go there in physical form. It's the collective unconscious. It's also known as one soul, or the dreamland or dream world. It's on the same level as Onesol, or the land of hallucination, but it's not the same. People get it confused." Dr. Purdieu didn't respond as he was in shock, which didn't matter as Delwyn was on a roll. "Right above those two levels are Meditar, the land of meditation, and Ether, the astral realm. I go there a lot too. Oh, I forgot to tell you that I go to Onesol a lot, but you already knew that because of my narcolepsy."
The doctor knew that he needed to say something to keep her going, but his mind was racing with the names of who he would need to contact after the session. Yes, tell me, Delwyn, what do you call the real world? She sniggered and said, Well, it's the real world, of course, but Varun calls it Aletheia, and what humans think is hell is actually called Nida, or Nida, I can't remember. It's a dark, negative place, but not like the fiery brimstone stuff that the idiots keep trying to say it is. Oh, really? Well, that's fascinating, Delwyn. You have a rich fantasy life. Delwyn suddenly sat up, turned her head towards him, and her face twisted in a snarl as she hissed, It's real! I already told you! I get there through a secret mirror! Having said her cue word, she immediately opened her eyes and looked over at Dr. Purdieu, who was visibly shaken and staring at her with his mouth wide open. The last thing Delwyn remembered talking about was her mother, and everything past that point was a blank. Are you okay? She asked, genuinely concerned, as he was almost a different person in comparison to the cool and collected doctor who had soothed her into a trance. Yes, of course, he said, jumping up and switching the recorder off. Well, how do you feel, Delwyn? He stammered and nearly tripped over the rug as he went back to his seat across the room. His pulse was racing, as it had been years since a patient had sent him off kilter like that. I actually feel refreshed, she said, beaming happily. Maybe you were right about hypnosis, although I think I blanked out for a moment there. She sat back in her chair and watched him nervously sip some of his cold tea. Then he flipped open his notebook and started scrawling down notes rapidly. Well, sometimes that happens, but let's make a time for your next session, shall we? She wasn't aware that he was secretly planning for her to have a battery of tests run at the psych unit in the city. Delwyn became suspicious after seeing his nervous display and asked, Hey, did something happen when I blanked out? You seem really jittery. He looked up, anxious now about his own safety. Well, you said a few things that maybe, I think that maybe you need further testing to make sure. He looked over at the clock and noticed that they'd gone over their time. Delwyn felt a frost creep over her skin. What did I say? Before he could answer, the doorbell rang. It was Gwen coming to get her, so he got up and raced over to the door, obviously relieved to be interrupted. Gwen! Oh, thank goodness! He gushed, grabbing her and dragging her inside. What's wrong? Is everything all right? What did she do? Gwen asked in amazement. Dr. Purdieu held his finger to his lips and whispered, Not here. I'll call you. I don't want to alarm you, but I want to have her fully tested for schizophrenia. Gwen's hands went to her face. Oh, no! I hope I'm wrong, but let's get her tested, only to be sure, he said, trying to reassure her. Then Delwyn came into the hallway, arms folded across her chest, annoyed but also slightly amused. With a little smile on her lips, she asked, What's going on here? Is everyone going nuts today? Both Gwen and Dr. Purdieu laughed way too loud and long, but Delwyn decided to leave them to it. For some reason she was remarkably calm and decided that whatever Dr. Purdieu thought he'd heard, she would deny it and refute the merit of hypnosis, telling her aunt that she'd simply retold a dream and that he took it way out of context. She would slam him as a crackpot and they would find another doctor. It was that simple. She thanked him on her way out and told Gwen that she would wait for her in the car. It wasn't long before Gwen joined her, and it was obvious that she was trying to fight back tears. As they drove off, she blurted out to Delwyn, You know, love, I know that I've said some harsh things to you, and I want to take the opportunity to apologise. The crying started with the last word, and she blubbered her way through further apologies and declarations of loyalty and love. Delwyn was dumbfounded, even though she understood what was happening. Auntie Gwen, what's wrong with you? I'm fine. I love you too. She reached her hand out and patted her on the arm. Do you want me to drive? Gwen shook her head and took out a handkerchief from her bra, wiping her face furiously and blowing her nose. "No, love, I'll be okay. I'm just worried about you." She burst into tears again, and Delwyn rolled her eyes. Maybe this whole thing wasn't worth all the drama. Come on, let's go home and I'll make you a nice dinner, okay?" Gwen straightened up in her seat, apparently realising how foolish she was acting. She needed to be the strong one. The tears slowed down, and she calmed herself, smiling and nodding at Delwyn, patting her on the hand. Delwyn decided to strike while the iron was hot. "I feel bad, you know. I tell the doctor about my narcolepsy and astral travels, and then he freaks out." She took a sidelong glance at her aunt to see if she'd swallowed the bait. She was nodding, but also seemed confused. "Oh, well, maybe he doesn't have that much experience with your kind of disorders, love. I'm sorry, I think we both got a bit carried away. Maybe hypnosis wasn't the best idea." They laughed and agreed that maybe it hadn't been a good idea, but both women continued the drive feeling uneasy, even though they kept up appearances and made light of the whole thing. When they got home, they both cooked together, but the vibe was different. They were both terribly polite with each other, as though they'd recently met for the first time. After dinner, Gwen came in and tucked Delwyn into bed, making her laugh at the absurdity of it. "Oh, well," said Gwen, "I used to do this when you were a little girl." Delwyn smiled at her aunt, and once more they were friends. Gwen stroked the hair off her forehead and smiled into her face, saying gently, "No matter what happens, Del, I'll be there for you." Delwyn reached her arms up around her shoulders and hugged her tightly. "Thanks, Auntie Gwen, I love you so much. Everything's going to be fine, I promise."